In 1991, I was 13 years old and I was glued to MTV. A revolution was happening in music and I soaked every bit of it up. It's hard to even quantify what it means to my life to this day. I'm going to talk you through 10 albums from my collection that I feel really defined the year of 1991 on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local but you are in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com. You can subscribe on YouTube and follow us across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and even TikTok now. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. We're going to talk about 1991. As I mentioned, I was just a kid. I can't really stress how important that year and honestly those couple of years of the early 90s really meant to me musically and really have framed the rest of my life in regards to what I still gravitate towards when I go to pick out a record or play some music. I don't think there'll be any big surprises on this list, honestly, unless you're completely unfamiliar with the rock or alternative genre, which is really what my passion is first and foremost. But I figured I'd pull them from my collection, talk through them. The biggest thing for me was just the sheer quality of the albums that came out all within 1 year. And you can almost do this with 92, 93, 94, 95, and then you could go back to the, obviously the late 60s, early 70s. You could do the same thing and easily pull like 10 classic, iconic albums from those years. 91 stood out. This is probably a series where I'll do, on other years as well, which I think would be fun. But if I'm going to kick off 1991 and talk about albums again from my collection that really defined the year, there's at least to me, there was an obvious place to start, and that is with the Black Album by Metallica. This is a Walmart exclusive, one of only a couple I have in my collection. I like this one because it's kind of on a clear, smoky black colored vinyl, which is cool. The Black Album was my introduction to Metallica. Like I said, I was 13 in 91, so I didn't have a chance to get into the mid to late 80s Metallica records until after MTV introduced me to the Black Album. It was pretty much my introduction to metal too, if you could call Metallica metal and call the Black Album metal. I do remember seeing the video for One, which obviously came before the Black Album. But when this hit and you had Enter Sandman and Sad But True and The Unforgiven and Nothing Else Matters, just all massive songs, that summer of 91, or really just the whole back half of 91, I just remember this album being such a huge record that played endlessly, not only on MTV and on radio, but I remember having the CD at that time and just wearing it out. And it was a game changer. Like, I had never heard heavy music that was so accessible and the hooks were so clean. And to me, even at that age, the songwriting was just so good and kind of straightforward to a way, which, again, not being a metal kid, at that time was something that I was able to grasp onto. So the Black Album to this day, I still think is a great starting point for anybody looking to get into Metallica. An argument could be made for obviously Master of Puppets and, even Kill 'Em All. I could keep going, but as far as 91 is concerned, the Black Album is the starting point for me. It's honestly one of a couple of the first records I think of when I go back in time. Another one, and again, so much of this harkens back to MTV for me because that's how I was consuming most of the music at the time. Before you can drive and you're not in the car all that much and you don't control the radio. So you're stuck at home, you got a TV in your bedroom, at least it did back then, and you could spend hours vegging out. And if you did, you would certainly run across some Guns N' Roses in 1991 because Use Your Illusions 1 and 2 were absolutely huge records. Obviously, they were the follow-up to Appetite for Destruction, which I was very familiar with, throughout the late 80s because it was so popular on radio. And then these dropped, and you had the double album concept, which to me at the time was like, oh my gosh, they're putting out 2 albums at once. How do we even consume that? And why are they not together? And why do they look the same but the colors are different? And what's the difference between the two? So there was a lot of like interesting things for me as a novice getting into these albums. Obviously, no November Rain was huge. That played endlessly, but you had covers like Knocking on Heaven's Door, and you had Live and Let Die. You had the big single for Don't Cry. But there's a ton of great album tracks on this. Locomotive is a great song. Estranged, Civil War. I could go on and on. I'm not a massive GNR fan. I've got their pinnacle albums, obviously, Appetite and Lies and these. They're not one of those bands that I put in my top 10 or top 20. For a lot of people they are. Just didn't squeak in there for me, just because a lot of these other albums really overtook what I was listening to, even though I did love Appetite and I did love these records, and I've held on to them to this day, obviously. But again, if I'm thinking 91 Metallica, GNR, just absolutely massive, and kind of set the stage, if you will, for what's to come. And that is, the transition into full-on alternative rock, and obviously the Seattle scene having a big play, and just, at least for me, took over my mind space, took over everything I was focused on as a kid at that time in regards to music. An album like this was huge. Gish by Smashing Pumpkins. Again, I remember it on MTV. I remember seeing the video for I Am One. I remember Siva being a big song. Just a great introduction to a band that obviously went on to do even better, bigger and better things, in my opinion, with Siamese Dream and Melancholy. But as far as a raw take on the Pumpkins, not as overly produced as they got into future records. So it's kind of interesting to see a little bit more of a raw approach from a production standpoint. I think this album holds up really well, and it gets a lot of play for me, even though I love the next couple as well. But Gish, it's kind of underrated because Siamese Dream was just so huge, let's be honest. But for real Pumpkins fans, I think it goes all the way back to Gish, and it's a really important record, too, because, again, I think it's starting to turn a corner in 1991 as alternative rock is becoming more mainstream and taking over MTV and radio. Smashing Pumpkins are, again, time and place, one of those bands that just really benefited from everything that was going on, and they were such a huge part of it, even though they weren't from Seattle, they were from Chicago, but it was happening, not only all over the U.S., but also just internationally as well. So Smashing Pumpkins Gish is number 3 on that list. I counted GNR as one record, by the way, so I could squeak them both in. All right, here's another one. Octane Baby by U2. Talk about a band undergoing a complete transformation. If you're familiar with U2 from the 80s, you had obviously an incredible run of albums, starting with War, honestly, and going through Joshua Tree and then into Rattle and Hum. They were, arguably the biggest band in the world at that time. And they decided to basically throw everything out the window after the Joshua Tree and Rattle a Hum. And as Bono said, dream it up again. So that's what they did with Octane Baby. I vividly remember this album. I wasn't a huge fan at the time. It took me many, many more years before I became a big U2 fan. But now I rank this as probably my favorite U2 record and one of my favorite albums of all time. It is just such a breath of fresh air coming out of the 80s, I think, into a world where the band was being really experimental as far as they were concerned. And, again, threw everything out. If you compare the Joshua Tree to this album, it's like 2 different bands, 2 completely different sounds. Other than Bono's voice, you wouldn't even recognize a lot of it. Songs like The Fly, and Even Better Than the Real Thing, and Mysterious Ways. Obviously, you had One as the ballad. Some of the album tracks on this are actually my favorite, and that would be, Ultraviolet, Acrobat, Love Is Blindness. I love all those tracks. Just such, again, a creative record that stands the test of time. And I think because of how outside the box the band was thinking, it somehow fit, it somehow worked on radio right in between Metallica and GNR and bands like that. That's what was great about music at that time. You could do anything, and it didn't necessarily matter if it fit a specific format, because that alternative, you know, label was kind of an all-encompassing thing. You had bands of all different genres kind of getting shoved into that, and radio was receptive to them, and MTV was receptive to them. So an album like Octane Baby, I think, just shines to this day. And again, you know, putting it back in 1991 really stood out, and helped them propel that band, U2, into a whole nother phase of their career as they went on to Zooropa and Pop and a bunch of other great albums that I love. So love Octane Baby to this day. Another band that was a lot around much earlier than 91 and was out at a bit of a crossroads is REM. This is Out of Time, one of their most popular classic records. Losing My Religion was obviously a huge hit and a huge MTV hit. You have Shiny Happy People, which is kind of the outlier on this album as far as from stylistically. Radio Song, In Game, just again, classic songs on a classic album. I wasn't a huge REM fan going into 91. Again, I was 13, so, you know, I was coming out of just being a kid, but I knew of the band. I knew they were kind of a college rock band, and they were making that transition from being more of a college indie band into more of the mainstream because of alternative radio and because they were getting more exposure. And this was I think again, kind of like Octane Baby. It's that transitional album for them, because after this they go on to do Automatic for the People and Monster and all these other great albums that were a little more alternative leaning versus maybe indie or college leaning. And it's another band too that took me years to get into. In 1991, I wasn't consuming Out of Time and Octane Baby. I knew the singles, I knew the bands, but it took me years to kind of go back to these albums, which is honestly just the joy of music, is getting to kind of discover these things after the fact. So I love REM to this day. They've really become one of my favorite artists. I respect them so much, and I think Out of Time is a fantastic record and definitely represents, out of my collection, what 91 was all about. Next on the list, I'm pretty sure I've featured this album in like 20 different videos. It's because I always come back to it. That's Temple of the Dog. Self-titled record, members of Soundgarden and Pearl Jam combining to form a supergroup in tribute to their friend Andrew Wood from Mother Love Bone, who had passed away. This was Eddie Vedder's first time to ever record on a real album in a real studio. All of the songs were written by Chris Cornell in tribute to Andy Wood, who was his roommate. And I listen to it probably weekly, still to this day. It's when I scroll by it on my phone, or when I walk by it when I'm picking something from my wall to spin, it's very hard for me not to gravitate towards this album. It is one of the most important albums in my life, and always will be, just because of what it represents in those two bands, which I am such huge fans of, coming together and writing just a perfect record. It was a great tribute. It's a great rock album through and through. Obviously, the big single was Hunger Strike, and then you had Say Hello to Heaven and Reach Down, which were the main two tracks that kicked it all off. But you can go top to bottom. You can take the ballads like Call Me a Dog and All Night Thing. I think those are some of the best songs Chris ever wrote. And then you've got tracks like Times of Trouble and Wooden Jesus and Pushing Forward Back. It's just great front to back, and I think was just exciting at that time for me to turn on MTV and see these two bands performing as one. Talk about mind blown. It was an unbelievable thing. So we'll segue right next into Bad Motorfinger, of course. So I was starting to hear of Soundgarden. I think I had heard and seen a little bit of the stuff off Louder Than Love, because again, that was their first major label release, and they were starting to get a little bit of airplay, at least where I am, down in Dallas, born and raised here. So, if you were up in Seattle or maybe in London or something, you would have heard a lot of these bands a lot sooner. But in Dallas, like, we didn't get Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and Temple of the Dog and all that until really Nirvana broke the mold, right? So Bad Motorfinger, even though I'd heard a little bit of Louder Than Love, was the real introduction. And that's because Outshined and Rusty Cage were massive singles. I didn't see the band on this tour. I didn't get a chance to see them until 94 on the Super Unknown tour. My mom would let me go to Lollapalooza in 92, where all these bands performed, unfortunately. But again, still to this day, a fantastic record. I think the instrumentation and the songwriting and everything that went into songs like Jesus Christ Posed and Holy Water, Mind Riot, Searching with My Good Eye Closed. Absolute beautiful record. It hits hard. The melodies are great. The instrumentation I mentioned is great. Odd Time Signatures by Matt Cameron. It just brought everything together and just, again, showed me like, oh man, this is what alternative rock is supposed to sound like. So Bad Motorfinger was huge. Had to be on this list, of course. I'll follow that up with, of course, Pearl Jam 10. This is almost all of these, not all of these, but a lot of these are original pressings. That was an original pressing of Bad Motorfinger. Out of Time was original. Gish was original. Octane Baby was original. This is an original that I bought in 91, or when it came out, actually, I'm sorry, in 93. It didn't come out on vinyl at first. It didn't come out till Versus actually came out on vinyl. I remember the moment I heard it. I remember it was my older brother who was playing it at a party because he was well into his high school years in 91, about to go away for college, and this album had just dropped, and I remember hearing Alive, and I remember just like, what in the world is that? Such a different voice I'd never heard, such a baritone voice. I was immediately attracted to it, and I remember by the end of that party, which was going on at our house, this was just on a loop. It was Pearl Jam 10 playing over and over. I walked away from that party just going, okay, I've got to find this. I had just bought a CD player, my first one ever. The first CD I ever bought was Southern Harmony and Musical Companion by the Black Crowes. I went out and bought this next on CD after that party, and it's been a game changer ever since, and never stopped listening to him. And I've seen him, I think 12 or 13 times or something, which pales in comparison to a lot of Pearl Jam fans. But to me, it's not a perfect record. I think the remix that Brendan O'Brien did around the 20th anniversary, I think, is even a better mix of the album. But the songs, especially the album cuts, Why Go and Oceans and Release and Once, those songs still speak to me so much. I love the singles too, but of course they've been overplayed so much. Alive and Even Flow and Jeremy and those songs, still love them. Love them live especially, but yeah, this album front to back still gets a lot of play and is simply a part of me, so it had to be on this list. Two more left, and again, no surprises here, but you've got the Red Hot Chili Peppers. There was not a bigger song on MTV, a bigger video than Under the Bridge, and then they followed it up with Give It Away, and just mind-blowing. I had no idea what type of music this even was. It was rock, it was funk, it was all over the place. I think I had probably heard, I definitely heard the Higher Ground single from Mother's Milk prior to Blood Sugar, maybe a couple of other early tracks, but again, being 13, this was the year where I was really starting to establish, like, okay, what am I going to be here from a musical consciousness? Like, who am I going to focus on, what genre? And this just like, completely took over my world. And so Chili Peppers were a big part of that. I didn't get a chance to see them not until the Californication tour, I believe, because like I mentioned in 92, I couldn't go to Palooza when you had Pearl Jam and the Chili Peppers and Soundgarden all there. But yeah, if I'm going to pick a Chili Peppers record to me that represents, the best of the band, this is still it. I like a lot of their stuff up to current day, but a song like Breaking the Girl, fantastic. I already mentioned Under the Bridge, Give It Away, the big singles, but The Power of Equality, Suck My Kiss, the title track. There's just so many songs. Sir Psycho Sexy. It's just a classic. You got to know this front to back. Such a creative record, and such a special time for, again, a lot of these bands when they really broke through on the mainstream, which was a weird deal for all of them, especially this one here, which last on the list. No Brainer, Nevermind by Nirvana. Again, another album that makes it in a lot of my videos and top 10s just because that's who I am and that's where I come from. But yeah, this broke open the entire thing. Like, you were starting to get glimpses. You would have on radio and in mainstream media and things like that. I remember on MTV, you really had to watch 120 minutes. Which was the late night kind of alternative show. You could hear Metallica, Guns N' Roses, and see those videos in normal rotation, REM for sure. But in order to hear a lot of the more indie stuff prior to this, you had to watch 120 minutes. And then this came out, and then it changed everything. Then the entire format flipped, and it was 24/7 alternative rock for a while. I mean, other than the big artists. So it was exciting to see that it was catching on, not only nationally but globally. And this album was everywhere, and it still is. And it's obviously one of the most iconic covers and albums and songs with "Smells Like Teen Spirit." I would say, again, like a lot of these I mentioned, the album tracks are what really stand out to me these days. "Breed" is probably my favorite Nirvana song ever. I love "In Bloom." I'm a terrible drummer, but I really love to try and hack it away at "In Bloom" because it's the drum fills on that are amazing. "Territorial Pissings," "Drain You," the closing track, "Something in the Way." If you haven't seen the I think it's called Classic Albums, where they go in the studio and break down a record. Fascinating episode on Nevermind, because they're sitting here with the great Butch Vig who produced it, and he just gives you a behind the scenes look on what went into it. They recorded it very quickly in a couple weeks in LA. They had no idea. They thought they were going to sell a couple copies. The story goes that they were hoping to sell as many as Sonic Youth, because that's who they were signed with on Geffen. It's kind of the reason why they signed with Geffen. Needless to say, it blew that out of the water. So there you go. There's 10 albums from '91 from my collection that were game changers. Like I mentioned, not a bunch of big surprises on this. I could have gone way deeper to 20 or 30. I made a list. You've got albums like "Loveless" by My Bloody Valentine, "Low End Theory" by Tribe, "Sailing the Seas of Cheese" by Primus, "No More Tears" by Ozzy, "Slave to the Grind" by Skid Row, "Into the Great Open" by Tom Petty, Cypress Hill's self-titled record, "Sky Is Crying" by SRV, "For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge" by Van Halen. The list is endless when you go back to these years from like I mentioned, the early to mid '90s or the late '60s, early '70s. Like those two time periods for me, it's just jaw dropping how many amazing, timeless albums came out within such a short period of time. You don't realize it at the time because you're living in the moment, but when you look back on it, man, it's something to look back and. I mean, these 10 albums alone, 11 if you count GNR's double records, just like these are some of the best albums of all time, in my opinion, underneath the rock genre, and they all came out in 1991. It's amazing to look back. Thanks for joining me to take that look back. We will see you again on another episode of Talking About Records. Stick around for some more content. Really appreciate the support as always, and we'll see you next time.